In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean lies a small volcanic island, seemingly insignificant on a map, yet holding immense strategic value during one of the most decisive moments of the Second World War. That island was Iwo Jima, positioned almost exactly midway between the Japanese capital of Tokyo and the American bases in Japan. It became a crucial focal point in the struggle between two nations locked in a fight that would determine the future of the Pacific. For the United States, Jima represented a vital stepping stone, a place where bombers could refuel and find safety after carrying out devastating raids over Japan. For the Japanese, it was the final defensive barrier, the last bulwark standing between the approaching American forces and the heart of their homeland. The stage was set in early 1945, as American forces prepared to launch an assault unlike anything the world had seen before. Thousands of young men, trained and hardened by previous battles across the Pacific, boarded ships and headed toward an island they knew would be defended with ferocity. The Japanese, fully aware of the importance of Iwo Jima, had fortified it with an extensive network of bunkers, tunnels, and artillery, determined to make every inch of ground cost as much blood as possible. The outcome of this clash was far from certain. The island was small, just 8 square miles, but its significance was vast, and both sides understood that the fate of future campaigns rested on the battle to come. As the story of Iwo Jima unfolds, it is not just a tale of strategy and military maneuvers. It is also the story of courage, sacrifice, and the human spirit under unimaginable pressure. Soldiers on both sides faced the terrifying reality of combat in an environment designed to break them. Yet many pushed forward with resilience and determination that still resonates through history. It is in these moments that we see not only the brutality of war, but also the extraordinary capacity of individuals to endure, to fight for survival, and to leave behind a legacy that would never be forgotten. Over the next chapters, we will dive into the fierce battles, the legendary raising of the flag on Mount Suribachi, and the voices of those who lived through this defining clash. You will discover why this small patch of volcanic rock became one of the bloodiest battlegrounds of World War II, and why its memory continues to echo across generations. If you are passionate about uncovering the hidden stories of history, the struggles, the triumphs, and the lessons that still matter today, then this journey into the Battle of Iwo Jima is for you. Make sure to like this video, share it with others who love history, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next chapter in our exploration of the past. Together, let us keep these stories alive, honoring those who came before us while learning from their experiences. In February of 1945, the calm surface of the Pacific concealed the storm that was about to be unleashed upon a small volcanic island whose name would become etched in the memory of nations, Iwo Jima. The invasion was not a sudden or improvised maneuver, but the result of months of careful planning, intelligence gathering, and relentless preparation. The United States had committed enormous resources to ensure success. Nearly 80,000 Marines, supported by the Navy's most powerful fleet of warships and an air force capable of raining destruction from above. For these young men, many barely out of their teenage years, the looming battle was shrouded in uncertainty. Yet they knew they were about to step into one of the fiercest struggles of the war. Across the waters, waiting for them on that black sand island, were about 20,000 Japanese defenders who had no intention of surrendering. They were not gathered in makeshift trenches or scattered outposts, but hidden deep beneath the island, in a vast network of tunnels, caves, and bunkers that had been painstakingly carved into the volcanic rock. This was no ordinary defense. The Japanese commander, General Tadamichi Kuribashi, had studied the pattern of American assaults across the Pacific and understood that to resist effectively, his men could not simply hold the beaches. Instead, he devised a strategy that relied on patience, concealment, and a brutal war of attrition. His soldiers dug into the earth itself, turning Iwo Jima into a fortress invisible to approaching invaders. They were connected through underground passages that allowed them to move unseen, emerging suddenly to ambush and then disappearing again. It was a grim but ingenious design meant to bleed the invaders of both time and strength, to make every yard of ground a costly prize. For the Marines, the anticipation was almost unbearable. The ocean journey toward Iwo Jima was marked by long days of drills, briefings, and the silent thoughts of what lay ahead. Many wrote letters home, unsure if they would ever send another. They knew the battle would be hard, but most had no idea just how difficult the island's defenses truly were. As the ships approached their target, the bombardment began. For 72 hours, American warships and planes pounded Iwo Jima, sending plumes of smoke and ash into the sky. The bombardment was so intense that some commanders believed few defenders could have survived. Yet beneath the surface, hidden in reinforced shelters, the Japanese waited almost untouched, conserving their strength and preparing for the moment the Marines set foot on shore. When dawn came on February 19, 1945, the order was given. Landing craft churned through the waves, carrying thousands of Marines toward the black volcanic beaches. The men gazed at the forbidding terrain ahead, its dark sands framed by jagged cliffs and the looming figure of Mount Suribachi, a dormant volcano that dominated the southern tip of the island. At first, the landing seemed almost easy. The Marines rushed onto the beach with little resistance, the silence eerie after the thunder of bombardment. Many believed the enemy had been destroyed or had fled deeper inland. But it was all part of Kuribayashi's plan. The Japanese had held their fire, waiting until the beaches were clogged with men, vehicles, and supplies before unleashing their full fury. Suddenly, the ground erupted with explosions. Machine guns hidden in pillboxes spat fire, mortars rained down from unseen positions, and artillery from the heights opened with deadly accuracy. The Marines found themselves trapped on soft volcanic sand that sucked at their boots and stalled their vehicles. There was no cover, no easy path forward, only the deadly rain of bullets and shells. Yet, despite the horror, they pushed on. Wave after wave of young men surged across the beaches, trying to carve out a foothold. Some fell instantly, others dragged wounded comrades to safety, while squads pressed forward inch by inch, determined not to give up. The courage displayed in those first hours set the tone for the entire battle. No matter how impossible the defenses seemed, the Marines refused to retreat. For the Japanese defenders, the beachhead became a killing ground, exactly as Kuribayashi had envisioned. They fought from hidden positions, striking quickly and then disappearing underground, forcing the Americans to fight for every bunker, every cave, and every scrap of terrain. Their determination was absolute. Surrender was unthinkable. They had sworn to fight until the very end, believing their sacrifice would slow the American advance toward Japan itself. This clash of wills turned the small island into a nightmare of fire, smoke, and blood. The Marines pressed inland under constant fire, while the Japanese defenders, though vastly outnumbered, used their cunning defenses to hold out far longer than anyone had expected. The reality of Iwo Jima soon became clear. It would not fall in days but in weeks, and each day would demand an unthinkable price. As the Marines pushed toward Mount Suribachi, the fighting grew more desperate. The volcanic rock made digging foxholes almost impossible, leaving men exposed to artillery and sniper fire. Supplies were difficult to move across the soft sand, and medics worked tirelessly to treat the endless stream of wounded. Yet the determination of the American forces did not waver. They knew that capturing Iwo Jima was essential, not only for the bombing campaign against Japan, but also for the thousands of pilots whose might be saved by having an emergency landing strip closer to the Japanese mainland. This was the crucible into which both nations had thrown their sons. 80,000 Marines advancing across hostile ground against 20,000 defenders hidden in a labyrinth of stone. It was more than just a battle for territory. It was a test of endurance, of strategy, and of the human spirit when pushed to its limits. What unfolded in those first days of February 1945 was the beginning of a clash that would leave scars not only on the island, but also in the hearts of all who fought there. The world would come to know Iwo Jima not just as a place on the map, but as a symbol of sacrifice, resilience, and the heavy cost of war. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was unlike many of the commanders who had preceded him in the Pacific War. He was not a reckless man eager to throw his soldiers into futile charges, nor did he underestimate the power of the American military machine. Having studied in the United States years before the conflict, he knew firsthand the industrial might, the discipline, and the relentless determination of his adversaries. He understood that Japan could not hope to match the United States in sheer numbers or resources. What he did believe, however, was that a carefully designed defense, carried out with absolute resolve, could bleed the American forces so severely that they might hesitate before striking at the Japanese homeland itself. This conviction shaped his orders to the men entrusted with holding Iwo Jima. Each soldier, he declared, was to fight until the very end, and in doing so, to ensure that his sacrifice took as many of the enemy with him as possible. The brutal arithmetic of his command was clear. If every man under him killed 10 Americans before falling, then the island would become a graveyard that might stall the enemy advance. Such an order was not simply a tactical calculation, but a reflection of the mindset that had taken root in the Japanese military during those desperate final months of the war. Defeat was not an option, and surrender was considered dishonorable. To Kuribayashi and his men, dying with purpose was preferable to living in shame. The men under his command accepted this with a grim sense of duty. They had fortified the island for months, digging tunnels and constructing bunkers so carefully concealed that even after days of bombardment, much of their network remained intact. They lived in darkness beneath the volcanic rock, breathing foul air, subsisting on meager rations, and waiting for the inevitable storm. Yet their resolve only hardened, for they knew their general expected each of them to turn his life into a weapon. When the Americans stormed the beaches, Kuribashi's plan began to unfold. The restraint his men had shown during the initial landings had lulled the Marines into a false sense of security. But once the beaches were crowded with men and equipment, the Japanese unleashed a withering fire that cut through the advancing troops. Every gun emplacement, every mortar, every hidden artillery piece had been positioned with meticulous care. The defenders had rehearsed their fields of fire until they overlapped seamlessly, creating kill zones where advancing Marines were struck from multiple angles. It was here that the general's orders came alive. Each Japanese soldier understood that he was expected to hold his position until death, and that the measure of his worth was how many enemies he could take with him. This philosophy of battle was devastating for the Marines, who soon realized that they were not facing an enemy who would crumble under overwhelming force. Instead, they faced opponents who seemed to appear from the earth itself, firing from hidden apertures and then vanishing back into the tunnels. When one stronghold was silenced, another would erupt nearby, and the cycle would begin again. The Marines advanced at tremendous cost, every yard gained purchased with lives and blood. For the Americans, it was a battle of endurance and adaptation. They relied on tanks, flamethrowers, and explosives to root out the defenders from their underground lairs. Yet even when a position was destroyed, many Japanese soldiers fought to the last bullet or grenade, fulfilling Kuribayashi's command to make every death count. The impact of this order extended beyond the battlefield. For the Marines, it meant that there would be no easy victory, no swift conclusion. Every step forward had to be fought for, and every night brought the fear of counterattacks launched from unseen tunnels. The psychological weight was immense. Men who had fought in previous battles across the Pacific often remarked that Iwo Jima was unlike anything they had ever faced, because the Japanese here were not fighting to win in the conventional sense, they were fighting to die as destructively as possible. It turned the island into a nightmare landscape, where courage was tested not just by the roar of enemy fire, but by the knowledge that the enemy would not stop until both sides had suffered beyond measure. Suribachi himself remained hidden deep within his command post, directing the defense with a calm resolve that impressed even his adversaries after the war. He forbade the banzai charges that had led to catastrophic losses in earlier battles, knowing they would waste lives without achieving meaningful results. Instead, he insisted on discipline, on using the terrain to maximum advantage, and on fulfilling his grim doctrine of inflicting maximum casualties. His men obeyed with unwavering loyalty, bound by both duty and the shared belief that their sacrifice would serve a greater purpose. For them, the island was not just a battlefield, but a sacred place where they would make their final stand. As the days dragged into weeks, the toll on both sides mounted. The Americans suffered staggering losses, far beyond what their commanders had anticipated, while the Japanese defenders were slowly ground down by overwhelming firepower. Yet even in the face of annihilation, Suribachi's men clung to their positions, each soldier trying to fulfill the general's demand that his death carry weight. In the end, the island would fall, but not before the Japanese defenders had inflicted one of the highest casualty counts of any battle in the Pacific. The cost was so severe that American planners began to dread what might await them if they had to invade the Japanese mainland itself. The doctrine that one man's life should claim 10 others was harsh, almost unimaginable. Yet it defined the spirit of resistance that made Iwo Jima one of the most ferocious battles in modern history. It revealed the desperation of Japan in those final months, the determination to fight to the bitter end, and the extraordinary burden it placed upon the young men who carried out those orders. For the Americans, it was a sobering lesson in the price of victory. For the Japanese, it was the embodiment of a sacrifice they believed would protect their homeland, even if only by delaying the inevitable. And for history, it was a reminder of the extremes to which human beings will go when caught in the crucible of war. When honor, duty, and survival collide on the battlefield, the thunder of naval guns and the roar of bombers filled the skies above Iwo Jima for days before the Marines made their approach. The sea itself seemed to tremble as wave after wave of artillery shells slammed into the island, throwing up clouds of smoke and ash. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers poured their firepower into the black volcanic terrain, while squadrons of aircraft streaked overhead, unloading bombs with precision meant to obliterate every possible defensive position. To the Americans observing from their ships, it seemed impossible that anything could survive such a relentless storm. The bombardment was among the heaviest ever unleashed in the Pacific, designed to clear the way for the landing forces and crush the resolve of the defenders before the first boots touched the shore. Commanders assured the Marines that the island would be nothing more than rubble, its defenders shattered and demoralized. Yet, beneath the smoke, the reality was far different. The Japanese had not built their defenses on the surface. General Suribachi, fully aware of American superiority in naval and aerial bombardment, had ordered his men to take shelter in the earth itself. Tunnels snaked for miles beneath the island, reinforced chambers served as barracks, and bunkers were constructed with layers of concrete and volcanic rock that could withstand even the heaviest shells. The defenders were not cowering in fear during the bombardment, but waiting patiently, hidden from sight, enduring the quakes and thunder above them. To the Marines on the ships, the plumes of smoke suggested devastation. To the Japanese below, it was little more than a warning that the time of testing was near. When the shelling finally ceased and the skies cleared, the island still stood, scarred on the surface but very much alive beneath. The Americans, confident that their firepower had done its job, prepared to land. They could not see the watchful eyes of the Japanese soldiers peering from concealed apertures or moving quietly through underground passages, readying themselves for the storm of flesh and steel about to descend upon them. The illusion of a weakened enemy was part of Kuribayashi's design. By withstanding the bombardment in silence, he allowed the Americans to believe their path forward would be less perilous than it truly was. The Marines had endured days of anxious waiting aboard their ships, and as they climbed into their landing craft, many believed the hardest part was behind them. The island looked like a wasteland, blackened and scarred, its vegetation gone, its ridges smoldering. To the young men about to hit the beach, it seemed unthinkable that a determined army could still be lurking there. Yet, the silence was deceptive. Beneath the black sands, thousands of Japanese defenders were preparing to unleash their fury. They had survived almost unscathed because their fortifications were not crude trenches, but intricate strongholds designed to resist exactly this kind of assault. As the landing craft churned toward the shore, some Marines allowed themselves to hope that the bombardment had worked, that perhaps the enemy had been buried or broken. The first waves reached the beach and encountered little more than scattered fire. The air was tense, the silence strange, as if the island itself were holding its breath. Vehicles rolled onto the sand. Men established positions, and commanders began to think the task ahead might not be as brutal as feared. Then, as more troops crowded the shore and supplies piled up in the open, the truth revealed itself. From hidden bunkers and disguised firing ports, the Japanese unleashed a storm of firepower that tore into the densely packed Marines. Machine guns cut swaths across the beach, mortars exploded in deadly arc, and artillery from the heights zeroed in with devastating accuracy. The bombardment the Americans had trusted to protect them had done almost nothing to weaken these positions. The enemy had simply waited it out, shielded by the very rock of the island, conserving their strength for this moment of maximum impact. The Marines, pinned down on treacherous volcanic sand that offered no cover and swallowed their boots with every step, realized that they had stepped into a trap. The shock of this revelation was immense. The confidence that days of shelling had destroyed the defenses vanished in an instant, replaced by the grim understanding that they faced an enemy who had not only survived, but had been preparing all along to meet them with deadly precision. What followed was a struggle unlike anything the Marines had faced before. The Japanese guns seemed to come from nowhere, and when one stronghold was silenced, another would erupt elsewhere, connected by tunnels that allowed defenders to fight, retreat, and reappear at will. The Americans were forced to adapt quickly, bringing in tanks and flamethrowers to try to root out the enemy from their hidden lairs. Yet even then, the Japanese fought to the last, fulfilling Kuribayashi's command that each life must be spent at the highest possible cost. The failure of the bombardment was not a failure of American power, but a triumph of Japanese ingenuity and determination. It revealed the limits of even the most destructive weaponry when faced with defenses crafted to endure. For the Marines on the ground, it meant the battle they had thought might be swift would instead become a grinding, bloody struggle for every inch of ground. The psychological toll was as great as the physical one. Men who had expected to land on shattered defenses now found themselves trapped under fire from enemies they could not see, fighting not just for ground but for survival in a hostile landscape that seemed to resist every step they took. The bombardment of Iwo Jima stands as a stark reminder that overwhelming force does not always guarantee victory, especially against an enemy prepared to sacrifice everything for their cause. For the Americans, it was a harsh lesson learned in fire and blood. For the Japanese, it was proof that their preparations had paid off, at least for the moment, allowing them to strike back with ferocity that far exceeded their numbers. And for history, It became one of the defining features of the battle, a demonstration of how strategy, discipline, and sheer willpower could render even the mightiest weapons less effective. In the end, the naval and aerial shelling of Iwo Jima did little to weaken the defenders who awaited below. The island, scarred on the surface, was still very much alive with resistance. As the Marines pressed inland, they would come to understand that the bombardment had not cleared their path, but had instead set the stage for one of the most brutal contests of the war, a contest in which courage, endurance, and sacrifice would be demanded in unrelenting measure. The morning of February 19th, 1945, dawned grey over the Pacific, the horizon blurred by smoke and mist as the landing craft pushed steadily toward the black sands of Iwo Jima. Inside the boats, Marines huddled shoulder to shoulder, their faces set with determination but shadowed by unease. Many had fought on other islands, Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, but none of them had seen terrain quite like this. Ahead lay beaches of volcanic ash, a surface so soft and unstable that it seemed to swallow everything that touched it. Beyond the shoreline, Mount Suribachi loomed like a dark sentinel, its slopes dotted with hidden caves and unseen eyes waiting to strike. The bombardment that had raged for days was over, and the silence seemed almost unnatural. Some dared to hope the defenders had been crushed, that the island had been broken. But the more experienced among them knew better. The Japanese had been waiting, and the moment the first boots hit the sand, the trap would spring. As the ramps of the landing craft slammed down, the Marines surged forward, plunging into the surf and struggling through the waves to reach the shore. The volcanic sand clung to their boots and weighed down their movements, making each step a battle in itself. Vehicles rolled off behind them, only to bog down almost instantly, their treads spinning uselessly in the ash. Supplies piled up as waves of men crowded the beach, the chaos of landing compounded by the treacherous terrain. At first, there was only scattered fire, the crack of a distant rifle or the thump of a mortar shell landing harmlessly in the surf. The illusion of safety held for a brief, fragile moment. Then, as more Marines pushed inland and the beach became crowded, the silence shattered. From hidden bunkers carved into the slopes, from gun ports disguised among the rocks, and from tunnels that ran like veins beneath the island, the Japanese opened fire with a precision that turned the shore into a killing ground. Machine guns swept across the beach, their streams of bullets cutting down men who had nowhere to hide. Mortar rounds exploded among the landing craft, throwing sand and shrapnel into the air. Artillery from the heights rained down with devastating accuracy, each shell finding clusters of Marines packed tightly together with no cover. The black sands offered nothing to shield them. There were no dunes, no ridges, only the open stretch of ash where every movement was exposed to enemy eyes. The men were trapped in the open, fighting not just against the enemy, but against the ground beneath their feet, which made running, diving, or crawling nearly impossible. The Marines pressed forward nonetheless, driven by duty and by the knowledge that retreat was not an option. Squads fought to find footholds in the shifting sand, advancing inch by inch under the withering fire. Some used the bodies of fallen comrades as cover. Others dug frantically into the soft ground with their hands, desperate for even the shallowest protection. Medics raced across the killing fields, dragging the wounded back toward the surf, their white armbands offering no protection from the relentless barrage. Officers shouted commands that were lost in the roar of gunfire, rallying their men to keep moving even as casualties mounted with terrifying speed. The invisible nature of the enemy added to the terror. The Marines could see the muzzle flashes of machine guns and the smoke from mortars, but the gunners themselves were hidden behind layers of rock and concrete, unreachable by small arms fire. Flamethrower teams and demolition squads tried to silence the bunkers, but each position destroyed seemed to be replaced by another, connected through the labyrinth of tunnels that allowed the Japanese to appear and disappear like ghosts. It was warfare unlike anything most of the young Marines had imagined. A deadly game of cat and mouse in which the defenders always seemed to hold the advantage. On the beach, the scale of loss was staggering. Men fell in clusters as artillery shells found their mark, and vehicles burned where they had been struck, filling the air with black smoke that mingled with the volcanic ash. Yet through this hellish scene, acts of extraordinary bravery shone. Marines carried wounded comrades through open fire. Machine gunners set up their weapons in the sand and laid down covering fire even as enemy rounds tore into their positions, and officers stood exposed, rallying their men with calm determination. Each step forward was a victory. Each few yards gained a testament to their courage. The Japanese, for their part, fought with a determination born of desperation and discipline. Kuribayashi's orders were clear. Every man must make his life count, and every American casualty was a step toward protecting the homeland. They fired methodically, conserving ammunition, never wasting a shot. Their positions had been planned with mathematical precision, overlapping fields of fire that ensured no part of the beach was safe. For them, the black sand was not a vulnerability but a weapon, a trap designed to slow and expose the enemy for slaughter. As the day wore on, the Marines began to carve out tenuous footholds. Tanks that had managed to reach the shore lent their firepower, blasting at bunkers and offering some measure of cover. Flamethrower operators braved enemy fire to pour jets of fire into pillboxes, forcing defenders out or sealing them within. Engineers worked to clear paths through minefields and obstacles, often under direct fire. Slowly, painfully, the Marines advanced, but the cost was almost beyond comprehension. By nightfall, the beach was littered with the wreckage of war-burning vehicles, shattered equipment, and the bodies of men who had charged bravely into the storm. For those who survived that first day, the memory would never fade. The black sand that had seemed lifeless and barren was now soaked with blood, a symbol of the price they had paid for their foothold on the island. They had faced an enemy they could not see, endured fire from positions they could not easily destroy, and pressed forward against odds that seemed insurmountable. Yet they had not broken, the beach had held, and though the road ahead promised even greater trials, the Marines had proven that they could endure the crucible. The storming of Iwo Jima's black sands stands as one of the most harrowing moments in the history of modern warfare. It was not just a clash of armies but a test of endurance, of spirit, and of the willingness to keep moving forward when every instinct screamed to stop. For the Americans, it was a lesson in sacrifice and resilience. For the Japanese, it was the embodiment of their determination to resist to the last. And for history, it was a moment that captured the essence of Iwo Jima, a battle fought on a landscape of ash and fire, where courage and suffering walked hand in hand, and where every inch of ground was bought at an unbearable cost. The voices of the young Marines who stepped onto Iwo Jima in February 1945 add a deeply human layer to a battle often remembered for its scale, its ferocity, and its strategic importance. Many of these men were barely out of high school, just 18 or 19 years old, carrying rifles that felt heavier than their bodies and shouldering responsibilities far greater than anything they had faced in their short lives. Some had enlisted with a sense of adventure, others out of duty, and many simply because it was expected of them during such a pivotal moment in history. Yet regardless of their reasons for joining, the reality that awaited them on the black sands of Iwo Jima would challenge their endurance, their courage, and their very understanding of survival. Fear was a constant presence for these young Marines, a shadow that clung to every step and every breath. The moment they hit the beach, machine gun fire cut through the air, mortars erupted around them, and the volcanic ash beneath their boots swallowed their movements like quicksand. Many admitted later that their first instinct was to cling to the ground and pray the storm of bullets would somehow pass them by. But training, discipline, and the example of those beside them pushed them forward. They had been told that fear was natural, but letting it control you was not an option. And so they rose, even when their instincts screamed to stay down, and pressed on toward the unknown, hearts pounding as loudly as the artillery that shook the earth around them. Alongside fear, there was courage, though it rarely came in grand gestures. Instead, courage often showed itself in quiet, fleeting moments. A Marine reaching out to pull a wounded comrade to safety, another returning fire despite trembling hands, or simply standing tall when the order to advance was given. Courage was less about the absence of fear and more about the decision to act despite it. For many, their bravery was not born of glory but of loyalty, an unspoken bond that tied them to the men fighting beside them. They were young, but in the chaos of Iwo Jima, they carried themselves with a strength that belied their years. Comradeship became the lifeline that kept them going when exhaustion and despair threatened to overwhelm them. Friendships forged in training camps were tested in the crucible of battle, becoming bonds stronger than steel. Marines often spoke of how their world shrank in those days to the men in their squad, the ones they ate with, marched with, and bled with. It was for them that they kept moving forward, for them that they took risks they might never have taken alone. Letters from survivors often recalled not the strategies of generals or the movements of armies, but the laughter shared in brief moments of calm, the reassurance of a hand on the shoulder, and the unshakable determination to never leave a friend behind. This spirit of brotherhood turned ordinary boys into warriors who endured the unimaginable. Yet the brutal realities of Iwo Jima could not be ignored. Death was ever present, a grim reminder that every step might be their last. The volcanic ash beaches became graveyards for countless young men, and the sounds of battle, the crack of rifles, the thunder of mortars, the cries for medics created a symphony of chaos that etched itself into their memories forever. Sleep was a rare luxury, food and water scarce, and nerves frayed by the constant threat of sudden ambushes from an enemy hidden in tunnels and caves. For these young Marines, every day was a struggle not just against the Japanese defenders but against their own fatigue, fear, and the haunting awareness of mortality. Some later admitted that their innocence vanished on Iwo Jima, replaced by an understanding of war's true cost. They witnessed acts of heroism but also the fragility of human life, learning quickly how thin the line was between survival and death. The island, though small and barren, became a place where youth was stripped away, leaving behind men marked forever by what they endured. Their courage, however, ensured that their suffering was not in vain. They carried the weight of the battle not only for themselves but for their country, for the hope of bringing an end to a conflict that had consumed the world. Through their testimonies, we see more than statistics of casualties or victories. We see the beating hearts of young men who confronted fear with courage, who found strength in one another, and who bore witness to both the horrors and the heroism that defined the Battle of Iwo Jima. Their words remind us that history is not just about nations or strategies, but about individuals, about 18-year-olds who became legends, not because they sought fame, but because they endured when endurance seemed impossible. It is in their voices that the true story of Iwo Jima lives on, a story of sacrifice, of brotherhood, and of the unbreakable spirit of youth thrust into the most brutal trial imaginable. Among the countless acts of endurance and sacrifice that defined the Battle of Iwo Jima, none were more poignant than the bravery of the corpsmen and doctors who walked into the storm of battle without rifles, armed only with medical kits and the determination to save lives. These men were the lifeline of the young Marines fighting through the chaos. While others sought cover from the relentless gunfire, The corpsmen ran toward it, drawn not by orders but by the cries of the wounded. Their presence on the battlefield was a fragile thread of humanity in a place consumed by destruction, and the risks they accepted each moment were as great as those faced by any combat soldier. Imagine the beaches of black volcanic ash already littered with casualties, the air thick with smoke and the roar of explosions never ceasing, and within that inferno, a corpsman crawling through the sand to reach a Marine who had been hit. The cries for Doc were constant, echoing across the battlefield, and each call meant another impossible decision: who could be reached in time, who could be saved, and who was already gone. With shells bursting overhead and bullets snapping past, they worked feverishly, cutting away uniforms soaked in blood, pressing bandages into wounds, administering morphine to ease pain, and whispering words of comfort as much as treatment. For many young Marines, it was the calm presence of a corpsman that kept them alive long enough to be carried to safety. Their courage was not measured by how many enemies they faced, but by how often they defied the instinct to protect themselves in order to shield another. To tend to the injured often meant exposing themselves to the very fire that had caused the injury. Yet they went forward without hesitation. Some corpsmen painted red crosses on their helmets, symbols meant to mark them as non-combatants. But these offered no protection from the unrelenting fury of battle. Still, they pressed on, sometimes dragging the wounded back with their own hands, sometimes lying flat beside them to stop the bleeding, refusing to abandon them even when the situation appeared hopeless. Doctors stationed just behind the front lines lived in a world no less brutal. Their makeshift aid stations were overwhelmed from the very first hours of the invasion, and the steady flow of casualties never ceased. Working in cramped tents or shallow dugouts, often under bombardment themselves, they were forced to perform operations with minimal equipment, hands slick with blood, their ears still ringing from explosions. In those conditions, there was no luxury of rest or reflection. Triage became a relentless rhythm, determining who might be saved with swift action and who had to be left aside. It was a burden that weighed heavily on them, for behind every decision was a face, a name, and often the desperate gaze of someone too young to be facing such a fate. Stories emerged after the battle of doctors who performed surgery for hours without stopping, their hands trembling with fatigue but never pausing, because the wounded kept coming. Some operated by the dim light of lanterns as night fell, the flickering shadows cast on walls stained with the aftermath of battle. The groans and cries of the injured became the soundtrack of their work. And yet through it all, they persevered, bound by duty and compassion. Theirs was not the glory of conquest or the recognition of medals, but the quiet, unyielding determination to preserve life in a place designed to take it away. For the Marines, the corpsmen and doctors became figures of near mythical stature. They were called angels of the battlefield, not because they carried divine powers, but because they represented hope when everything else seemed lost. To a Marine bleeding out in the sand, the sight of a corpsman crawling toward him meant the difference between despair and the possibility of survival. Many survivors of Iwo Jima later admitted that they owed their lives not just to their own will to endure, but to the courage and skill of the medical men who refused to let them die alone. The risk was staggering, and many of these medics paid with their lives. They moved constantly through the most dangerous zones, often marked by sniper fire that sought them out precisely because their loss would demoralize the troops. Yet even knowing this, they continued their work, a testament to a kind of bravery that went beyond the battlefield's logic of attack and defense. It was the bravery of selflessness, of choosing to face death again and again so that others might live. When the battle finally subsided and the island was declared secured, the memories of those days did not fade for the corpsmen, doctors, or the Marines they treated. For those who had been saved, the image of a hand steadying them, the sound of a voice telling them to hold on, remained seared in memory. For the medical men who had done all they could, The faces of those they could not save remained equally vivid, a reminder of the limits of even their greatest efforts. In reflecting on Iwo Jima, it is easy to focus on the strategies, the commanders, and the iconic flag raising atop Mount Suribachi. But beneath these symbols lies the quiet heroism of those who gave themselves not to take lives but to preserve them. The story of the corpsmen and doctors is one of sacrifice in its purest form, an example of courage untainted by ambition, a reminder that even in the darkest hours of war, there exists an unwavering commitment to compassion. Their legacy endures not in monuments or medals, but in the lives they saved, and in the enduring respect of every Marine who once called for Doc and found that someone was there, ready to answer. Mount Suribachi loomed over the island of Iwo Jima like a watchful guardian, its volcanic peak dominating the battlefield below. For the Marines who had fought tooth and nail across the black sands and through the maze of hidden defenses, the mountain was more than a geographical feature. It was the heart of Japanese resistance and the key to the island itself. Every movement on the beaches, every landing craft that approached the shore, every attempt to push inland was observed from that high vantage point. And as long as the enemy held it, the entire invasion force remained under constant threat. Taking Suribachi was not just a tactical necessity, it became a mission that carried with it symbolic weight. For the men understood that seizing the mountain would break the stranglehold the defenders had over their brothers fighting below. The assault on Suribachi was grueling. The Japanese had transformed the mountain into a fortress of interconnecting tunnels, bunkers, and hidden artillery positions. Marines advancing up its slopes faced not open combat but sudden bursts of fire from unseen positions, machine guns hidden behind rocks, and mortars erupting from invisible pits. Every step upward felt like a battle in itself, and the men who climbed those slopes carried not only their weapons and packs but also the hopes of thousands still engaged on the beaches. Inch by inch, the mountain was contested, its volcanic ash offering no solid footing, its defenders emerging suddenly from underground passages only to vanish again like phantoms. Despite the ferocity of the defense, determination drove the Marines forward. Squads advanced with grim focus, using grenades and flamethrowers to clear out entrenched positions, often at devastating cost. Accounts from those days describe the surreal feeling of fighting on ground that seemed alive with enemy fire, where every boulder or crevice might conceal danger. Yet the young Marines pressed on, bound by their training, by their loyalty to one another, and by the knowledge that capturing Suribachi would change the course of the battle. Finally, after days of relentless struggle, the summit was reached. The Marines who climbed to the top carried with them a flag, not large or ceremonious, but a symbol nonetheless. When it was raised, fluttering in the sulphurous wind above the island, a cheer rose from the men below, carrying across the beaches and through the smoke-filled air. For a moment, amidst the chaos and destruction, there was a surge of triumph, a sign that the impossible could be achieved. The sight of the flag meant that progress was real, that sacrifice had not been in vain, and that hope could rise even from the most desolate battlefield. But the raising of the flag on Mount Suribachi was not the end of the battle. Fierce fighting still raged across the island, and thousands more lives would be lost before Iwo Jima was secured. Yet that moment became something greater than the tactical victory it represented. It was captured in a photograph that would become one of the most enduring images of the war. A frozen instant that conveyed not just military success but the spirit of unity, perseverance, and sacrifice that defined the Marines' struggle. For those who fought there, the flag was not merely a piece of cloth, but a reminder of the cost of reaching that summit, of the brothers who had fallen on the slopes, and of the determination that carried the survivors upward. To the Marines on the ground, the flag's presence was more than symbolic, it was a source of renewed strength. Seeing it waving from the peak reassured them that despite the overwhelming obstacles, victory was possible. for the corpsmen and doctors working tirelessly among the wounded. It brought a moment of solace, a reminder that their efforts contributed to something larger than the suffering that surrounded them. For the young men entrenched in foxholes or crawling across fields of ash, it gave a reason to keep moving forward, to endure another hour, another day. In the face of unimaginable hardship, the significance of capturing Suribachi also reverberated far beyond the island. Back home, the photograph of the flag raising reached newspapers and newsreels, becoming an instant icon. Families who feared for their sons could see in that image a reflection of courage and resilience, a moment of pride amid the uncertainty of war. It served as both a morale booster and a rallying cry, embodying the sacrifices being made not just on Iwo Jima but across the Pacific. For the American public, it crystallized the idea that the struggle, however painful, was leading toward eventual victory. Yet for those who were there, the photograph could never capture the full truth. Behind the triumph lay untold suffering, and behind the image of 6 men raising the flag stood thousands of others who endured the same horrors but would never be immortalized. The Marines who fought on Iwo Jima knew that the flag symbolized victory, but it also represented loss, the comrades who had fallen, the youth that had been consumed, the lives forever changed by the climb up that volcanic slope. In the years that followed, Mount Suribachi's flag raising became part of history, celebrated and remembered as a defining moment of the war. But for those who lived it, the memory was personal and profound. They remembered the exhaustion in their bones, the weight of the rifles slung across their shoulders, the smoke that choked their lungs, and the way their hearts surged when the flag finally rose against the grey sky. It was not just a symbol of victory, it was a testament to endurance, to sacrifice, and to the unyielding will of those who refused to stop climbing. Thus, capturing Mount Suribachi was more than a turning point in a single battle. It was a moment that distilled the essence of the Marines' struggle on Iwo Jima. It embodied the unity of purpose, the depth of sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of a goal that seemed unattainable until it was achieved. The flag that flew atop the mountain became an enduring symbol, not just for the men who raised it, but for every soul who fought and suffered on that island. It was a reminder that even in the darkest hours, amidst fire and loss, the human spirit could rise, unbroken, and declare that hope would not be extinguished. As the battle for Iwo Jima dragged into its later stages, the ferocity of the fighting only intensified. Even with Mount Suribachi captured and the American flag flying high, the island was far from secured. The Japanese defenders, bound by an unshakable code of duty and led by the unwavering resolve of General Kuribayashi, refused to consider surrender as an option. To them, the island was sacred ground, and their role as defenders of the homeland demanded resistance to the last man. This mindset shaped the final, brutal phase of the battle, where the fighting was no longer about territory alone but about endurance, sacrifice, and the clash of two reconcilable wills. The Japanese soldiers had prepared for this moment long before the first American boots touched the beaches. Kuribayashi, unlike many of his contemporaries, had abandoned the idea of futile banzai charges at the outset of the battle. Instead, he directed his men to fight from concealed positions, to use every tunnel and bunker, to make the Americans pay for every yard with blood. Yet as the battle wore on, and their numbers dwindled under relentless bombardment and assaults, even this careful strategy gave way to desperation. Out of food, water, and ammunition, many Japanese soldiers embraced death as their only remaining path, charging out of their positions in sudden waves of suicide attacks that sought not victory, but the highest possible cost in enemy lives. For the Marines, these encounters were harrowing. After days of grinding advances against hidden fortifications, The sudden eruptions of screaming soldiers rushing into their lines at night or from unexpected corners of the battlefield brought new waves of terror. Every Marine knew that such attacks meant a fight to the death, and the chaos they unleashed often left whole units disoriented and scattered. Yet through discipline and sheer resilience, the Marines held their ground, cutting down the charges at staggering cost to the attackers. Even then, there was little sense of triumph. Watching men fight to the death with no intention of survival left many Marines shaken, confronting them with a level of determination that was as frightening as it was relentless. The toll on both sides was staggering. American forces paid dearly for every advance, their casualties mounting day by day. Corpsmen and doctors worked ceaselessly in aid stations overflowing with the wounded, their hands trembling from exhaustion as they tried to keep pace with the endless stream of casualties. For the Marines still in the field, the losses were felt most keenly in the empty spaces left by friends who had fallen. Squads that had landed together in full strength were reduced to a fraction of their original numbers, and replacements arriving at the front lines often found themselves stepping into positions that had been vacated only hours before by those who had given their lives. For the Japanese defenders, the cost was even more absolute. They fought with an awareness that there would be no relief, no reinforcement, no possibility of survival. Each day their ranks grew thinner, their positions collapsed under bombardment, yet their refusal to surrender remained unbroken. This iron will was both awe-inspiring and tragic, for it meant that the island would be soaked in blood until the very last defender fell. In the final days, small pockets of resistance continued to harass the Marines, often launching desperate nighttime assaults that ended in annihilation. Even when defeat was inevitable, they chose death over capture, leaving behind a legacy of defiance that haunted the survivors who witnessed it. Among the Marines, the psychological toll of facing an enemy who embraced death was profound. Many later recalled how it eroded the sense of victory, replacing it with exhaustion and a grim recognition of the cost. They had been trained to fight an enemy who sought to win, but here they faced opponents who sought only to die while inflicting as much damage as possible. It blurred the lines between strategy and sacrifice, turning every engagement into a clash not just of weapons but of wills, where survival itself became the only measure of success. Despite the horror, there were moments of grudging respect. Some Marines admitted that they admired the tenacity of their enemy, even as they despised the consequences of that resolve. They recognized in the Japanese defenders a mirror of their own determination, a reflection of the same unwillingness to yield that had driven them up the black sand beaches and over the slopes of Suribachi. It was a recognition that did not lessen the brutality of the battle, but added to its weight, for it underscored the reality that both sides were trapped in a struggle that demanded everything they had to give. When the battle finally ended after more than a month of unrelenting combat, the island was a ruin. Nearly all of the 20,000 Japanese defenders had perished, their bodies scattered among the tunnels and caves they had fought so fiercely to defend. American casualties were staggering as well, with thousands killed and tens of thousands wounded. The ground that had been so fiercely contested was now silent, but the memory of what it had cost lingered heavily in the minds of those who survived. The refusal of the Japanese to surrender ensured that Iwo Jima would be remembered not only as a military victory, but as one of the most punishing battles in history. For the Marines, the capture of the island meant securing a vital base for the bombing campaign against Japan. But the victory came at a price that few could celebrate without a sense of sorrow. For the Japanese, the defense of Iwo Jima became a testament to their devotion and sacrifice, even in certain defeat. In the end, the battle was defined by this collision of wills: an American force determined to secure the island at any cost, and a Japanese garrison determined to resist until the last breath. The result was a struggle of such intensity that it remains etched into the collective memory of both nations. The refusal to surrender did not alter the outcome, but it ensured that the cost of victory would be measured in blood, in grief, and in the haunting legacy of men who fought to the very end. The Battle of Iwo Jima stands as one of the most harrowing chapters in the history of the Second World War, not only for the scale of the combat, but for the sheer human cost it carried. For 36 relentless days, Marines and Japanese defenders clashed across the island's black volcanic soil, each side driven by duty, loyalty, and an unwavering determination that defied imagination. By the time the fighting ended in late March 1945, the cost was staggering. Over 6,800 Americans lay dead, and nearly every one of the 20,000 Japanese defenders had been killed. The island was secured, but victory came draped in sorrow, paid for with the lives of young men who would never return home. For the survivors, Iwo Jima was never just another battle. It was a crucible that stripped away illusions of glory and revealed the raw reality of war: fear, courage, sacrifice, and loss in their most unrelenting forms. The young Marines who walked away from that island carried with them not only the scars of battle, but also the memories of comrades who had fallen at their sides. For the corpsmen and doctors, the faces of those they could not save remained etched in their hearts forever. Even decades later, the veterans who spoke of Iwo Jima often did so with heavy voices, pausing to remember the brothers left behind and to acknowledge the price that had been paid. The Japanese defenders, too, became part of this legacy. Their refusal to surrender, their willingness to fight and die to the very last man, left an impression on the Americans who fought them. It was a tragic testament to the strength of conviction and the terrible cost of war when two sides refused to yield. To the Marines, the Japanese were not faceless enemies, but men who had given everything for their cause. And in that recognition lay a grim respect. When the flag was raised on Mount Suribachi, the image became immortal. But behind it were the thousands of sacrifices that made that moment possible. The photograph symbolized victory, yet it also symbolized grief. For every inch of ground taken had been purchased with blood. It was a reminder that freedom is never free, that the ideals of peace, liberty, and justice demand sacrifices that cannot be measured in numbers alone. Each fallen Marine was a son, a brother, a friend. Each Japanese soldier was likewise someone's family, someone's loved one. Humanity itself paid the price for the ambitions of war. The legacy of the battle lives on not just in monuments and history books, but in the lessons it continues to teach. Survivors often reflected on how the brutality of Iwo Jima made them cherish peace all the more deeply. They knew firsthand that war was not a game of victories, but a relentless machine of suffering. And their voices became reminders that the pursuit of peace must always be valued above the call to arms. The enormous cost of that small island underscores an enduring truth that while war may sometimes be fought in the name of freedom, it is peace that sustains it. As we look back on Iwo Jima, we remember not only the military achievement, but also the human dimension, the bravery of young men far from home, the compassion of medics who risked everything to save the wounded, the unyielding defense of soldiers who refused to surrender, and the weight of loss carried by survivors on both sides. It is a story of unimaginable hardship, yet also of resilience and brotherhood, of the human spirit rising even in the darkest of times. And so, as we close this chapter, let us honor the memory of all who fought on Iwo Jima by carrying forward the lesson they left behind, that the cost of freedom is high, and that peace must never be taken for granted. Their sacrifice was not only for victory in war, but for the hope of a world where such battles would never again be necessary. Thank you so much for joining me in revisiting this powerful story. If you found it meaningful, please remember to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you more history told through the voices of those who lived it. Your support helps keep these stories alive, reminding us of the past and inspiring us to build a better future. And now, wherever you are, I hope you carry with you the message of Iwo Jima, the importance of peace, the value of sacrifice, and the resilience of the human spirit. Rest well tonight, and may your dreams be filled with hope rather than conflict. Thank you again.